composed demeanor giving nothing away. "It is not so much an honor as it is a necessity, Mademoiselle Wilde. There are still some details of the case that require further examination. I must ask you a few questions about your time at Ashford Manor and about Lady Evelyn's final days." The maid's gaze did not falter as she poured a glass of water. "I was but a humble servant, Monsieur Poirot. I didn't think my observations would hold much weight." "I disagree," Poirot replied. "Everyone has something to contribute, no matter their role. You were there, Mademoiselle Wilde, during the hours leading up to Lady Evelyn's death. I believe you may have seen something, heard something, that others did not." The maid's eyes shifted slightly. For a moment, Poirot caught a flicker of emotion, a flicker that spoke of something buried deep beneath the surface. Miss Wilde hesitated, but then nodded, setting the glass of water down with a small sigh. "You are right, monsieur. I did hear something, but I am not sure it means much. Lady Evelyn, she was troubled, yes. She spoke often of a secret. She said she could feel the weight of it, as though it would one day crush her. She mentioned the locket." Poirot leaned forward, intrigued. "The locket? The one that was found near her body?" Miss Wilde nodded, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Yes, that locket. She always kept it close to her. She said it was a gift from someone very dear to her, someone she loved deeply. I never asked who it was, but I could see the way she held it, the way it seemed to comfort her." "And did she ever mention anyone else?" Poirot pressed. "Anyone who might have wanted to harm her?" Miss Wilde shook her head. "No, not directly. But she was always wary of Sir Marcus. She said he could be dangerous when provoked. Didn't understand what she meant until later, until after she was gone." Poirot paused, processing the new information. Dangerous when provoked. And yet, she stayed with him. She trusted him. Miss Wilde's expression darkened. Lady Evelyn was a woman torn between love and fear. She loved Sir Marcus, but she feared what he could become. I think she was trying to break free, but she was trapped. He had a hold on her, one she could not escape. The maid's revelation. There was a silence between them, broken only by the sound of the crackling fire. Poirot's thoughts raced, piecing together the fragments of truth that had been revealed. The locket was not just a symbol of affection, but one of control. Lady Evelyn had been caught in a relationship that seemed to offer love, but in reality, it had been suffocating her. And Sir Marcus, he had played his role with expert precision. He had manipulated not just Lady Evelyn, but everyone around him, including Miss Wilde. Poirot's voice broke the silence. "Mademoiselle Wilde, you said something earlier that intrigued me. You mentioned a secret, something Lady Evelyn was afraid would eventually crush her. Could you elaborate?" Miss Wilde bit her lip, clearly struggling with her words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't just a secret about Sir Marcus. It was something from her past. Before she married him, Lady Evelyn had been in love with someone else, someone who had disappeared under strange circumstances. She never spoke much about it, but I know she believed that person's disappearance was tied to Sir Marcus." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. "Who was this person, mademoiselle?" "I don't know," Miss Wilde replied, shaking her head. "But I think Lady Evelyn believed that Sir Marcus had something to do with it. She feared that the truth would come to light, and that would destroy everything. The true motive. Poirot stirred and began pacing slowly around the room, his mind running through the facts like a detective working in reverse. The pieces were aligning, but there was still one final key he needed to uncover. Sir Marcus. He didn't just kill Lady Evelyn for her wealth or her love. Poirot muttered to himself, his voice growing clearer. No, he killed her to silence her, to prevent her from revealing the truth about the person she'd loved before him, the one who had disappeared. Miss Wilde looked up in confusion. But who could it have been? Poirot turned sharply to face her. That, mademoiselle, is the final part of the puzzle. But it is a part that will require further investigation. Miss Wilde remained silent, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. But Poirot could see the faintest glimmer of understanding in her gaze. The truth, he was certain, was buried deeper than anyone had anticipated. A new direction. Poirot left Miss Wilde's modest residence and stepped back into the night. His mind buzzed with new questions. The locket, the secret of Lady Evelyn's past, and Sir Marcus's obsession with control. It was all part of a larger game, one that Poirot had barely begun to understand. In the quiet of the night, as the storm had passed, and the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Poirot knew one thing for certain. The truth had not yet been fully revealed. The veil of deception was still in place, and it was his task to pull it away, piece by piece, until the final truth came into focus. The path forward. Poirot walked briskly, his mind already formulating a new plan of action. He would need to speak to those who knew Lady Evelyn before Sir Marcus had come into her life. He would need to uncover the identity of the man she had once loved. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would find the link that tied Sir Marcus to the disappearance of that person. Chapter 12. The Echoes of the Past. The morning sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow on the grounds of Ashford Manor. The quiet tranquility of the estate stood in stark contrast to the storm of intrigue that had taken root within its walls. Hercule Poirot sat in his study at the manor, the light filtering through the windows, illuminating the stack of papers, letters, and photographs scattered before him. His mind raced as he sifted through the clues, the memories of the case mingling with his sharp intuition. The discovery of the locket, the cryptic nursery rhyme, and the hidden history of Lady Evelyn Ashford. These elements were pulling Poirot in a dozen different directions. But one thing was certain: the murder was no accident. Sir Marcus Ashford had not simply acted out of passion or jealousy. There was a much darker motive at play. Poirot could feel the weight of the unsolved mystery pressing down on him. Their truth had yet to be uncovered, and the walls of deception were thick. A knock at the door broke Poirot's reverie. He looked up, his expression calm yet expectant. "Enter," he called. The door creaked open, and Claudia Vale stepped into the room. Her face was drawn, her expression weary, but there was a fire in her eyes that had not been there the night of Lady Evelyn's murder. She had been distraught then, torn by grief and uncertainty. But now, something had shifted. Poirot could see that she was ready to face the truth, no matter where it led. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of urgency. "I need to speak with you. It's about my aunt, Lady Evelyn." Poirot nodded, motioning for her to take a seat. "Please, Mademoiselle Vale, tell me what is on your mind." Claudia hesitated for a moment before sitting down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking, ever since that night, there's something I didn't tell you. Something I should have mentioned earlier. Something about Lady Evelyn's past." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "I think it might help you understand why she was so terrified of Sir Marcus." Poirot leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Go on, Mademoiselle Vale. I am listening." Claudia took a deep breath. "Before she married Sir Marcus, my aunt was engaged to a man named Richard Fairmont. He was an artist, well known in society, but not wealthy. My aunt loved him dearly. They had planned to marry, and everything seemed perfect. But one day, Richard disappeared. No one knew where he had gone. It was as if he vanished without a trace." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And did Lady Evelyn ever speak of this disappearance?" Claudia nodded. "She spoke of it often, but only in whispers. She always believed that something sinister had happened to Richard, that someone was responsible for his disappearance. She never told me exactly who, but I could see the fear in her eyes every time she mentioned it. I believe Sir Marcus knew more about Richard's disappearance than he let on." Poirot's mind was already working, connecting the pieces Claudia had given him. A man named Richard Fairmont, an artist who had disappeared just before Lady Evelyn's marriage to Sir Marcus. The connection to Sir Marcus was becoming clearer, but there was still so much left unsaid. "Do you have any more details, Mademoiselle Vale? Any information that could help me understand this better?" Poirot asked, his voice soft yet insistent. Claudia hesitated again, her gaze distant, as if she were lost in the past. "There was one thing. My aunt told me, shortly before her death, that she had seen Richard again. She said she saw him at the manor, standing in the garden one night. But when she approached him, he disappeared. She was terrified, Poirot. I think she believed Richard was still alive, and that he was trying to warn her." Poirot absorbed the information carefully. "And what did Sir Marcus think of all this?" Claudia's face twisted with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Sir Marcus dismissed it. He said my aunt was imagining things, that her grief was playing tricks on her mind. But I could see that he was nervous, as if the idea of Richard coming back to haunt them unsettled him deeply. That's why I'm sure he knew more about Richard's disappearance than he was letting on." The artist's secret Poirot's mind raced as he processed this new information. The connection between Richard Fairmont's disappearance and Lady Evelyn's murder was now a focal point of his investigation. The question that lingered was why Sir Marcus would want to kill his wife. Was it truly to silence her, or was there something else at play? Had Richard's return, or the threat of his return, been a trigger? "Tell me, Mademoiselle Vale," Poirot said, his voice thoughtful. "Do you know where I might find more information about Richard Fairmont? Do any of his family or friends still live nearby? Is there anyone who could shed light on his disappearance?" Claudia looked up, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'm not sure, Monsieur Poirot. I don't think anyone ever truly searched for him after he vanished. His family was in the countryside, but I don't think they ever came to Ashford Manor after that. The whole thing was brushed aside. My aunt never spoke of it again, and Sir Marcus made sure that no one would ask questions. "But I'll try to find out. There must be someone who knows something." Poirot gave a small nod. "Very well. I will begin my search elsewhere. If you find anything, mademoiselle, please let me know immediately." As Claudia rose to leave, Poirot's mind remained focused on the key detail that had been revealed. Richard Fairmont, the man who had disappeared, the man whom Lady Evelyn had loved, and the man who, it seemed, had returned from the shadows of the past. There was more to this case than just a marriage gone wrong. The truth was buried in the echoes of the past, and Poirot was determined to uncover it. The past unveiled. Poirot's next stop was the local library. He had requested all available records on Richard Fairmont, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain his sudden disappearance. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Holloway, led him to a section of the library that contained old newspapers, journals, and personal letters from the region. As Poirot began to sift through the yellowed pages of old newspapers, he found several articles that referenced Richard Fairmont. He had been a promising artist with a reputation for capturing the essence of the countryside in his paintings, but his disappearance had made headlines, not for its mystery, but for the fact that no one had seemed to care. It was as if the world had simply moved on without him. One article caught Poirot's attention. It was a brief mention of a confrontation between Fairmont and a wealthy man in town, a man who was described only as a jealous rival who had a strange influence over Lady Evelyn. Poirot read the article again, his mind racing. "Jealous rival," he muttered to himself. Could this be the key? The more he read, the clearer it became. Richard Fairmont had not disappeared of his own volition. No, something more sinister had taken place. He had been silenced, just as Lady Evelyn would be if she had continued to uncover the truth. A hidden truth. Poirot returned to Ashford Manor, his thoughts racing. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but there was still much left to understand. He knew that he would need to confront Sir Marcus once again. This time, however, it would not be with the intention of catching him in a lie. It would be to force him to reveal the truth about Richard Fairmont, and the truth about the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface of Ashford Manor all along. Poirot took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had no doubt that the truth would be revealed, but whether it would be enough to bring justice to Lady Evelyn was another matter entirely. The final step of Poirot made his way to Sir Marcus's study. He couldn't help but feel a sense of finality in the air. The walls of Ashford Manor seemed to be closing in on him, the weight of history pressing down with each step. He knew that the truth he sought was within reach. The echoes of the past were finally beginning to speak, and he was ready to listen. "Sir Marcus," Poirot said as he entered the study, his voice calm but resolute. "It is time we speak of Richard Fairmont." Chapter 13. The Final Thread. The night had fallen swiftly over the countryside, cloaking the estate in a deep, mysterious silence. The large darkened windows of the grand manor house reflected the moonlight, and the rustle of the trees outside could barely be heard in the still air. Inside, Hercule Poirot sat in the drawing-room, a room dimly lit by a solitary lamp placed on a polished wooden table. His fingers tapped gently against his lips as he contemplated the case before him. A final clue had emerged. one so innocuous, so seemingly trivial, yet utterly profound in its implications. He could almost feel the weight of it now, pressing upon his thoughts. It had come, like all the best deductions, from a small observation, a subtle detail hidden in plain sight, just as it had been with the nursery rhyme, that had initially seemed so benign. In the end, Poirot knew the answer lay not in the physical evidence, nor in the hasty conclusions drawn by those around him. It had always been about understanding the human psyche, the delicate interplay of motives, and the smallest cracks in a person's facade. As he waited, his mind continued to spin, connecting the dots, weaving together the scattered bits of truth. He could feel the conclusion drawing nearer. But not yet. No, not yet. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The door to the drawing room creaked open, and Captain Hastings stepped inside, his face creased with concern. "Well, Poirot, I suppose it's time," Hastings said, his voice low but steady. "The others are gathered in the dining room, awaiting your decision." Poirot looked up at him, his sharp eyes glinting with the unmistakable gleam of a man on the verge of a great revelation. "Yes, Hastings, it is time. But not yet. First, there is one final piece to place in this puzzle." He stood up from his chair and walked slowly across the room, his polished shoes clicking softly on the floor. "You see, mon ami, the true nature of this crime is something more subtle than anyone has yet realized. A nursery rhyme, a seemingly innocent bit of verse. But it contains within it a map, a roadmap to the truth." Hastings frowned. "But Poirot, surely we've exhausted every angle of that rhyme. It's just children's nonsense." Poirot smiled, a small enigmatic smile that seemed to hold both mystery and assurance. "Ah, Hastings, you underestimate the power of the mind. A rhyme may be simple, but the human mind is anything but simple. It is a labyrinth, full of twists and turns. And in that rhyme, my friend, lies the key." Hastings was silent for a moment, clearly trying to grasp Poirot's meaning. Then, with a slight shake of his head, he simply replied, "I never understood how you do it, Poirot. How do you always see what no one else can?" Poirot turned toward him, his expression softening just slightly. "It is all about observation, Hastings, but not just of the facts, of the emotions, the contradictions, the smallest details that others overlook. That is where the truth lies. And now, I believe it is time to reveal the truth." With that, he nodded toward the door. "Shall we, my friend? The others are waiting." Together, they made their way down the long hallway, their footsteps echoing through the stillness of the manor. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation. Hastings could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him as they reached the dining room, where the remaining suspects and witnesses had been gathered. The large oak doors were opened, and Poirot stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the group. Each person sat at the table, their expressions a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. The gathered individuals were a motley crew of suspects, all with their own secrets, all with motives that had seemed plausible in the early days of the investigation. Poirot's eyes landed on each of them in turn: Lady Evangeline, the grieving widow, her brother, the sharp-tongued businessman, the charming but reserved artist, and even the quiet, seemingly inconspicuous maid who had raised Poirot's suspicions since the beginning. He studied them all, his mind already working to piece together their roles in the grand drama that had unfolded. "I trust you are all comfortable." Poirot's voice rang out cool and composed. He took his place at the head of the table, his fingers steepled before him in his customary pose of quiet authority. "We are waiting for your insights, Monsieur Poirot," said Sir Reginald, though sage businessman, his tone just a touch too eager. "It's been some time now, and we are all eager for the truth to be revealed." Poirot gave him a measured smile. But truth, Sir Reginald, is not something that can be rushed. It must be understood in its own time. And so, my friends, let us proceed with caution. You will all play a part in this conclusion." He paused, for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room once again. "I have considered all of your alibis, your motives, your behaviors, but there is one thing that none of you have yet mentioned. One detail that until now has been overlooked." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as Poirot slowly and deliberately looked each person in the eye. The tension was thick, and the faintest sound, the softest breath, seemed magnified in the quiet space. "I will begin with the rhyme," Poirot continued, "the nursery rhyme that has puzzled us all. At first glance, it seemed nothing more than childish nonsense, an insignificant piece of the puzzle. But in fact, it was far more than that. It was a clue, a very subtle clue that pointed towards the answer all along." He let the words linger in the air before continuing, his voice calm but unwavering. "The rhyme spoke of a certain number of steps, a certain sequence, and each of you played a role in that sequence. But what it truly revealed was not simply the actions of the crime, but the deeper motives behind them." Poirot turned to Lady Evangeline, his gaze piercing. "Lady Evangeline, your grief was real, yes. But your actions were not entirely as they seemed. The love you professed for your husband, was it genuine, or was it something far more pragmatic? The rhyme hinted at a relationship much more complex than the one you portrayed. Could it be that your tears were not for him, but for what you stood to gain?" Lady Evangeline shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but she did not speak. Poirot's gaze then moved to the others, and he continued, laying out the intricacies of the crime. Each person, as he revealed the connections between them, seemed to shrink under the weight of his deductions. The carefully crafted facades that they had built were unraveling, one thread at a time. As Poirot spoke, Hastings observed the reactions of the suspects. Each of them, it seemed, was hiding something, but it was clear that the true nature of the crime was far more intricate than anyone had anticipated. Yet, Poirot, with his unerring logic, was beginning to expose the lies that had kept them safe until now. Chapter 14. The Final Revelation. The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation, the only sound being the faint rustle of clothing and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath the feet of the gathered suspects. Hercule Poirot's presence dominated the space. Every eye was fixed on him, as though he were the conductor of an orchestra, poised to bring an end to the dissonance of confusion that had plagued them all. He had made his initial observations, the seed of doubt now planted in each of their minds. It was a game now, the final stage of this psychological puzzle. Poirot's eyes flickered briefly to the various faces in the room. There was Lady Evangeline, her expression a blend of anxiety and defiance. Sir Reginald the businessman sat ramrod straight, his fingers twitching ever so slightly as he resisted the urge to reach for his drink. The artist, a man of measured composure, appeared entirely unreadable. But Poirot was certain that beneath his calm demeanor there were emotions at war. And then there was the maid, still as a shadow, her eyes darting nervously between the others. Poirot did not rush. He took his time, allowing the silence to stretch out like a fine thread, taut but never breaking. It was clear that the pressure was mounting. Each suspect was aware that Poirot had discovered something crucial, something that would reveal the truth behind the murder that had rocked the household to its core. The rhyme, the nursery rhyme that had seemed so harmless at first, had become the linchpin. It was no longer a simple piece of poetry. It had become the map to the heart of this crime. I will say it plainly. Poirot's voice broke the tension, smooth as velvet but with an unmistakable edge. This murder, as it seemed at first, was not a crime of passion, nor a crime of opportunity. No, it was far more methodical, far more calculated. Each of you, yes, each of you, played a part in this web of deceit. There was a sharp intake of breath from the group, and Poirot could feel the weight of their suspicion turning toward him. The room was charged with tension, the unsaid words hanging in the air, heavy and accusing. Poirot paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he surveyed his audience. You see, mon ami, the crime was not committed for the reasons you might have believed. It was not about love, nor greed, nor revenge. It was about something far more fundamental: control. The true motive behind this murder was the need to control. Control of wealth, of power, of one's own destiny. And more importantly, the need to control others. He leaned forward slightly, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Lady Evangeline, you thought your position as the grieving widow would shield you. But you overlooked one thing, your desperation. Yes, you wanted the inheritance, but more than that, you needed to be seen as the innocent, the wronged woman. That is why you resorted to theatrics, your tears, your helplessness. But it was not your husband's death that made you a victim. It was your own choices, your manipulation of everyone around you. You wanted power, but not the kind you could earn. No, you wanted it handed to you on a silver platter. Lady Evangeline's face was pale, her lips trembling as she struggled to maintain composure. She did not speak, but her eyes betrayed her guilt. Poirot turned his attention to the others, his gaze sharp and deliberate. Sir Reginald, he continued, you were quick to condemn Lady Evangeline, to distance yourself from the murder, as if it had nothing to do with you. But your actions reveal a different story. You are not simply an innocent bystander in this case. You, too, played a part. You wanted your sister's inheritance, of course. But more than that, you were protecting your own position, your business dealings, your empire. It was all at risk. A sudden change in the family's wealth would disrupt everything you had worked so hard to build. But you were clever, weren't you? You planted seeds of doubt, manipulated the police, and created an illusion of your own innocence. There was a shift in Sir Reginald's posture. His eyes darkened, and he cleared his throat, but his voice was steady. I don't know what you're implying, Poirot. he said, his tone defensive but lacking conviction. Poirot smiled faintly. You do not need to say it, Sir Reginald. Your actions spoke louder than words. You wanted control over your future, and you thought you could secure it by framing someone else. Poirot then turned to the artist, who had remained mostly silent throughout the evening. His eyes were fixed on the table, but Poirot knew he had been watching every move, every word spoken. Poirot had long suspected the artist's involvement, not because of anything overt, but because of the subtle way he carried himself. Always slightly detached, always observing but never fully engaging. "Ah, Monsieur Lemoine," Poirot said, his voice a touch lighter but no less piercing. "You too had your reasons, did you not? It was not just your artistic ambition that drove you to this crime. No, it was your relationship with Lady Evangeline. She gave you a taste of what you desired, yes? But you were not content to simply be her lover. No, you wanted more. More recognition, more power, more security. Your art was but a small piece of the puzzle. It was her fortune that you sought, not the fleeting admiration of a few patrons." The artist's eyes darted up, and for a moment Poirot saw a flicker of something, a mix of fear and regret. Before it vanished behind his practiced calm, he opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, unsure whether he should deny the accusation or remain silent. "And you, Mademoiselle Claire," Poirot continued, his gaze turning to the maid, who had been quietly observing the conversation. "You thought you were invisible, didn't you? But you too had a part to play in this drama, a quiet, overlooked figure, playing the role of the dutiful servant. But what if I told you that you were not as innocent as you seemed? What if I told you that you knew more about the events leading to the murder than you let on?" The maid's eyes widened, her hands clasped tightly together. She bit her lip, trying to maintain her composure. But Poirot could see the tension in her body. It was her nervousness that gave her away. The small tremor in her hands, the sudden sharp intake of breath when her name was spoken. "Mademoiselle Claire," Poirot said softly, "you had your own reasons for helping to orchestrate this crime. You were not just a bystander. No, you were a willing participant, driven by something more than mere loyalty. What did you seek, Mademoiselle Claire? Was it power too? Or was it the promise of a different life? One that you could have only by aligning yourself with those who held the real power in this house?" The maid swallowed hard, and a single tear escaped from the corner of her eye. She looked down, unable to meet Poirot's gaze. It was then that Poirot knew. He had unraveled the truth. Each person in this room had their own motive, their own way of wanting to control the situation. They had all sought to manipulate others, to secure their futures at the expense of another. But in the end, it was their collective need for control that had driven them to murder. Poirot's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. "Ah, mes amis," he said softly, "the game is up. You thought you could outwit me, but in the end, it is always the truth that prevails." Hastings stepped forward, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Poirot, you've done it again. You've solved it." Poirot turned to his old friend, his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "Was not I, Hastings, who solved it? It was the truth that revealed itself, piece by piece, through the smallest of details. It always does. And so in that room, under the harsh light of revelation, the truth was laid bare. The murderer was caught, the lies unraveled, and justice, as always, was served. Chapter 15. A Dance with Shadows. The rain fell in steady sheets, creating a murmur as it pattered against the windows of the grand estate. The sky was an ashen gray, and the world outside seemed to be trapped in a perpetual twilight, where everything appeared muted and distant. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, saturated with the lingering tension of recent revelations. Hercule Poirot sat in his usual chair, his hands steepled before him, his mind still working, unraveling the final threads of the complex web that had entangled the inhabitants of this household. Beside him, Captain Hastings stood by the window, looking out at the gloomy scene beyond. The detective had long since solved the central puzzle, exposing the criminal machinations that had led to the murder. Yet, even now, Poirot's sharp mind was not at ease. There was still something amiss, an intangible feeling that gnawed at him. He had solved the crime, yes, but there was more. Something beneath the surface, something that had been left unsaid, a final piece that refused to fall into place. "You are troubled, my friend," Hastings remarked, his voice betraying concern. "The case is over. The criminal has been apprehended. Yet, you seem as though you are still searching for something." Poirot looked up at him, his sharp eyes gleaming with a quiet intensity. "You are right, mon ami. I am troubled. The case, though solved, has left me with a feeling of unease. There is something unfinished about it. The truth has been revealed, but I sense a deeper layer that I have yet to uncover." Hastings gave him a puzzled glance. "But Poirot, surely you have uncovered all there is to know. The clues fit together perfectly. The nursery rhyme, the motives, the behavior of the suspects. What else could there be?" Poirot did not immediately respond. Instead, he stood, walking over to the small fireplace where a crackling fire burned. The flames cast flickering shadows across the room, dancing in the darkened corners like specters of the past. Poirot stood there for a moment, lost in thought, before finally speaking. "It is not the crime itself that troubles me, Hastings. It is the human element, the emotions, the drives, the hidden desires, that seem to have been the true motivators behind everything. In this case, it was not a single desire for wealth or power that led to the murder. It was a combination of motives all tangled together, each one feeding into the other, like gears in a machine that when one turned, made the others move." Hastings listened carefully, but the layers of Poirot's analysis seemed to escape him. "But Poirot, you've explained everything so clearly. Lady Evangeline wanted the inheritance. Sir Reginald sought to protect his empire. Mademoiselle Claire was driven by her desire for something more. Each of them had their own reasons. But in the end, it was their ambitions that led to the crime." "Oui, Hastings," Poirot said with a slight nod. "That is the surface explanation. But, you see, there was more at play here. It was not just ambition that drove them. It was fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being exposed. Fear of the unknown. Each of them had something to hide, something they were terrified would be discovered. That fear, more than anything, was what pushed them to commit murder." Hastings' brow furrowed. "So, You think that fear of being exposed was what made them kill? Precisely, Poirot replied, his voice soft but filled with conviction. But not just fear of being exposed in the literal sense. No, Hastings, it was fear of being seen for who they truly were. Fear of being stripped of the masks they had spent so long building. You see, the nursery rhyme, the one that seemed so innocuous at first, was not just a clue to the murder. It was a reflection of their deepest fears, their darkest insecurities. Hastings shook his head, still trying to piece it together. I don't understand, Poirot. How could a nursery rhyme hold such significance? Poirot smiled slightly, his eyes gleaming with a mix of pride and determination. Ah, mon ami, you underestimate the power of the human psyche. The rhyme, with its playful rhythm and innocent words, masked a truth far darker than any of them were willing to admit. Each verse was a mirror to the fears of the suspects. Lady Evangeline, Sir Reginald, Monsieur Lemoine, and even Mademoiselle Claire. They saw the rhyme not just as a child's verse, but as a warning, a reminder of their own vulnerabilities. The detective walked back to his chair, sitting down with a deep sigh. Lady Evangeline saw herself as the damsel in distress, the victim of circumstances beyond her control. But beneath that mask, she was driven by a desperate need for power. Sir Reginald, ever the businessman, was consumed by the idea of losing his empire, and so he manipulated everyone around him, including his own sister. Monsieur Lemoine, the artist, sought recognition and admiration, but he was plagued by insecurity, fearful that his work would never be appreciated for what it truly was. And Mademoiselle Claire, the quiet servant, was afraid of being overlooked, of being nothing more than a shadow in the background. Hastings shook his head in awe. Poirot, you're suggesting that the nursery rhyme was more than just a clue to the murder. It was a reflection of their deepest fears, their insecurities. Exactly, Poirot said, his voice steady. And it was that fear, more than anything, that led them to commit murder. The need to silence the one who threatened to expose their vulnerabilities, to eliminate the person who could unravel their carefully constructed facades. Hastings stood in silence for a moment, processing the detective's words. So, you believe that each of the suspects saw the rhyme as a symbol of their own weakness, and that fear of being exposed was what drove them to kill? Yes, Hastings, Poirot said, his voice firm. But there is one more thing I must tell you. The nursery rhyme was not just a reflection of their fears. It was also a symbol of their guilt. Each of them knew, deep down, that they were responsible for their own downfall. They feared being exposed, yes, but they also feared facing the consequences of their actions. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in thought. You see, mon ami, the rhyme was not merely a piece of childish nonsense. It was a key that unlocked the truth hidden beneath the surface of this case. The rhyme spoke to their fears, their guilt, and their desire for control, and in the end, it was that very rhyme that led me to the heart of the mystery. Hastings stood silently, absorbing the full weight of Poirot's words. He could sense the depth of the detective's insight, the way he had connected the dots in ways that no one else could. Poirot had always been a master of reading people, of seeing beyond the surface and understanding the intricacies of human nature. In this case, as always, It was his understanding of the human psyche that had solved the crime. "And what of the final piece, Poirot?" Hastings asked quietly. "What was the last clue that led you to the truth?" Poirot smiled, a faint glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Ah, Hastings, it was not one clue, but the culmination of all the little details. The rhyme was the starting point, but it was the way the suspects reacted to it that revealed their true motivations. Their fear, their guilt, their desire for control. It was all there, in the way they spoke, the way they moved, the way they looked at each other, and in the end, it was their own actions that led to their undoing." Hastings nodded, finally understanding. So, it was their own fear of exposure, of being seen for who they truly were, that drove them to commit the murder. "Exactly," Poirot replied, his voice soft but certain. "In the end, the truth was not just about the crime itself. It was about understanding the human condition, the fears, the desires, the vulnerabilities that drive us all. That's, mon ami, is what I have learned from this case." The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the room, there was a sense of quiet resolution. Poirot had solved the mystery, but more than that, he had uncovered a deeper truth about the human heart. The final revelation was not just about the identity of the murderer, but about the way fear and guilt can shape our actions, leading us down dark and dangerous paths. Chapter 16. The Final Act. The mist rolled in from the river, shrouding the mansion in an eerie fog that seemed to swallow up the world. Even the vibrant garden, once a patchwork of colorful blooms, now appeared faded and ghostly under the heavy cloak of the early morning mist. Inside, the grand dining room was filled with an unnatural stillness, as though the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. Hercule Poirot stood at the grand window, his sharp eyes scanning the blurred world outside, his mind still turning over the complexities of the case. There was something about the rain and the mist that seemed to mirror the murkiness of the human soul, with its hidden desires, fears, and insecurities. The detective had solved the case, yes, but something still felt unresolved, as though a shadow lingered over the final revelation, threatening to eclipse the truth. Captain Hastings, ever loyal, stood beside him, looking out at the same scene, his expression thoughtful. "Poirot, you seem more distant than usual. Is something still troubling you?" Poirot's gaze lingered on the mist, his fingers tapping lightly against the glass. "It is not the case that troubles me, mon ami. It is the nature of the case itself. So much has been revealed, yet I feel as though I have uncovered only the surface of something far deeper." Hastings furrowed his brow. "But Poirot, the case is solved. The murderer has been unmasked. The clues have all been pieced together. What more could there possibly be?" Poirot turned, his sharp eyes meeting Hastings with a knowing intensity. "You see, Hastings, the solution is not always as clear as one might think. There is always more beneath the surface, always, and this case, I fear, is no exception." The words hung in the air like a promise, one that had yet to be fulfilled. The sound of footsteps approaching broke the silence, and the door to the dining room opened to reveal Lady Evangeline, her elegant figure framed by the doorway. She stepped inside, her demeanor as composed as ever, though there was a certain tension in her posture. as if the weight of the last few days had begun to take its toll on her. "You wanted to see me, Poirot?" she asked, her voice steady, though a trace of weariness lingered in her tone. Poirot gestured to the chair across from him, his expression unreadable. "Please, Lady Evangeline, have a seat. There are a few matters that I must discuss with you." She hesitated for a moment, then gracefully took the chair, folding her hands in her lap as she met Poirot's gaze. Hastings took a step back, sensing that the conversation would soon turn to matters he did not fully understand. With a quiet nod, he excused himself, leaving the two of them alone in the room. For a long moment, Poirot simply studied Lady Evangeline, his gaze penetrating, as though he was searching for something hidden beneath her composed exterior. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Lady Evangeline, you are a woman of great strength. I have seen it in your actions, your demeanor, the way you have carried yourself through these troubling days. But there is something I must ask you, a question that has been on my mind since the very beginning." She raised an eyebrow, her composure unshaken. "What is it, Poirot?" Poirot leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled before him as he regarded her with an almost unsettling intensity. "Why did you insist on keeping the truth of the nursery rhyme a secret? Why did you attempt to conceal its true meaning, despite knowing that it was the key to unraveling the mystery?" Lady Evangeline's eyes widened slightly, and for a brief moment, a flicker of unease passed over her features. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cool mask of a woman who had learned long ago to guard her emotions. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice steady, but a hint of uncertainty creeping in. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, his eyes never leaving hers. "Ah, mais oui, you do. You knew exactly what the rhyme represented, Lady Evangeline. It was a reflection of your fears, your insecurities. You were frightened, not of the crime itself, but of what the rhyme might expose about you, about your past, about your true nature." Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the chair, but she made no other movement. "You're mistaken, Poirot. I have nothing to hide." Poirot's smile remained, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "That is what you would like to believe, non? But deep down, you know the truth. The rhyme was not just a clue, it was a mirror. A mirror that reflected not only the killer, but also the darkness within each of you. Your fear of being exposed for what you truly are. Your guilt, your shame." Lady Evangeline inhaled sharply, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't know what you're implying. I did what I had to do to protect myself, to ensure that my inheritance would not fall into the wrong hands. What does that have to do with anything?" Poirot's eyes softened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It has everything to do with it, Lady Evangeline. You see, it was not just your desire for wealth or power that led you to your actions. It was your fear of losing control, of being vulnerable. And that, my dear lady, is what drives so many of us to commit acts we later regret." She looked away, her expression faltering for the briefest moment before she composed herself once more. "I did what I had to do, and I'm not ashamed of it." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "You say you are not ashamed, but you are, aren't you? You are ashamed of the lengths you were willing to go to protect your position, to keep your secrets hidden. And that is why you tried to suppress the nursery rhyme. You hoped that by keeping it in the dark, you could keep the truth buried with it. Lady Evangeline's lips pressed together in a thin line, but she did not respond. The silence between them grew heavy, and Poirot could sense that the conversation was reaching its critical juncture. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes softening as he regarded her one last time. The truth, Lady Evangeline, has a way of coming to light, no matter how much we try to bury it. It is not just the crime that must be confronted, but the deeper truths that lie beneath it, the fears, the regrets, the motivations that drive us to make the choices we do. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. The weight of Poirot's words hung in the air, as palpable as the mist that clung to the world outside. The detective had reached the heart of the mystery, but the final unraveling was yet to come. Poirot rose from his chair, his expression thoughtful but resolute. "The case is over, Lady Evangeline. The murderer has been caught, and justice will be served. But remember this, truth always finds its way to the surface. And when it does, we must be prepared to face it, no matter how uncomfortable it may be." With that, he turned and walked to the door, leaving Lady Evangeline alone in the room, her thoughts swirling like the mist outside. The case was over, but the real reckoning was just beginning. Chapter 17. The Final Confrontation. The night had settled over the estate like a heavy, suffocating blanket, and the once pristine grounds now lay beneath a veil of shadows. The only sounds that could be heard were the distant calls of night creatures and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. A storm was approaching, its winds pushing through the tall trees, bending their branches in protest. It was as if nature itself sensed the gathering tension, the unraveling of a long-held secret that was about to come to light. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The grand hallway, lined with portraits of stern ancestors, felt colder than it had in days. The tension that had been mounting throughout the investigation had reached its peak, and now Hercule Poirot stood in the center of it all, preparing for the final act of his meticulous investigation. He knew that the truth was at hand, but as always, it required patience, precision, and a sharp mind to see it through. Captain Hastings, who had accompanied him throughout this most perplexing case, could sense the change in his friend. Poirot, usually composed and confident, seemed to carry a weight that went beyond the case at hand. It was as if the detective had reached a point where the mental strain of solving the mystery had become almost unbearable. "You seem distant, Poirot," Hastings remarked, stepping into the room where Poirot stood. The dim light from the chandelier above cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the detective's thoughtful expression. "What's troubling you?" Poirot did not immediately respond. Instead, he adjusted his tie with a small but deliberate motion, his fingers working the fabric with the precision of a master craftsman. After a moment, he turned to his companion and spoke softly, as if the very words he was about to utter required careful consideration. "It is not the case that troubles me, mon ami. It is the nature of the case. We have arrived at the end, but I feel as though we are still missing something, a piece of the puzzle that has yet to fall into place." Hastings frowned, unsure of what Poirot meant. "But Poirot, you solved it. The murderer is caught, the motive clear. What else could there possibly be? Poirot's sharp gaze met Hastings's with an almost unsettling intensity. "Ah, but you see, Hastings, the mind is a complex thing. We have examined the facts, but we have not yet delved into the true nature of the crime. The emotions, the fears, the motivations behind it all. Those are the pieces that remain hidden, buried deep beneath the surface." Hastings opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door to the study opened, and Lady Evangeline entered. Her presence seemed to fill the room, her elegant figure carrying an air of both composure and quiet dread. She had been an integral part of the case, and Poirot knew that she had more to reveal. "Poirot," she began, her voice steady but tinged with the faintest trace of anxiety. "You asked to see me." Poirot nodded, motioning for her to sit across from him. His demeanor was calm, but there was an edge to his voice that was unmistakable. "Yes, Lady Evangeline, we are nearing the conclusion of this investigation, but there is one last matter that we must address. One final piece of the puzzle that must be put in place." Lady Evangeline hesitated, but then sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "What do you mean? I thought everything was clear. The culprit has been caught. The evidence is all there." Poirot's eyes, sharp and calculating, never left her face. "The evidence is one thing, but the truth, Lady Evangeline, is another. You see, the crime was not just about the murder itself. It was about the manipulation, the psychology, the hidden motives that drove each of you to act in the way you did. The question then is not who killed, but why." Hastings watched as Poirot's words landed heavily in the room. Lady Evangeline's face remained inscrutable, but Poirot could see the faintest twitch of unease in her expression. She was hiding something that Poirot had suspected from the very beginning. "You must know by now," Poirot continued, "that the nursery rhyme held the key to this entire case. It was not just a clue. It was a symbol, a manifestation of the emotions that led to the crime. You understood that rhyme, Lady Evangeline, in a way that none of the others did." Lady Evangeline's expression flickered, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't understand what you're implying. I was merely a witness to the events. I had nothing to do with it." Poirot leaned forward, his voice lowering as he carefully examined her every word. "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, mon ami. The nursery rhyme was not just a clue about the killer. It was about you, and your fear of losing everything you had worked so hard to protect." Lady Evangeline's eyes widened, but she quickly masked her reaction. Poirot could tell that his words had struck a nerve. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was a victim in all of this, just like the others. I had no reason to." "But you did have a reason," Poirot interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "You see, Lady Evangeline, it was not just about inheritance or wealth. It was about control, about the need to hold on to something that you feared would slip through your fingers. You knew deep down that your world was built on fragile foundations, and you were desperate to keep it intact." Lady Evangeline's hands clenched tightly in her lap, her nails digging into the fabric of her dress. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. Poirot let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the air between them. Finally, She spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what does that mean, Poirot? Are you accusing me of being the murderer?" Poirot's eyes softened, though his gaze remained intense. "No, Lady Evangeline, I am not accusing you of being the murderer. What I am suggesting is that you were not just a passive bystander in this tragedy. You were complicit, perhaps without even realizing it." Lady Evangeline looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" Poirot smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the quiet satisfaction of a mind that had solved the riddle. "You knew, Lady Evangeline, that the nursery rhyme held the answer. You knew that it pointed to something deeper, something darker, and you tried to suppress it, to keep the truth from being uncovered." Hastings shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension that had escalated in the room. He could see that the final confrontation was nearing, and Poirot was about to reveal the truth that had eluded them all for so long. Before Lady Evangeline could respond, the door opened again, and the rest of the household entered, each one carrying their own secrets, their own lies, their own fears. Poirot turned to face them, his eyes sweeping over the group with the intensity of a lion about to pounce on its prey. "It is time," Poirot said, his voice calm but resolute. "Time to confront the truth. All of you have played a part in this game, whether knowingly or not. Now, we will uncover what has been hidden, and we will see who among you has the courage to face what has been done." The stage was set. The final act of the mystery had begun, and Hercule Poirot was ready to unveil the truth that had been buried for far too long. Chapter 18. The web tightens. The evening air outside had grown cold, the dark sky only pierced by the dim light from the distant stars. The storm, which had been nothing more than a whisper earlier in the day, now roared through the trees, sending branches swaying with every gust of wind. Inside the mansion, however, the temperature was tense with anticipation, as Hercule Poirot stood in the drawing room, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of those around him. The gathered group looked uneasy, each of them aware that the detective was about to reveal something that would shatter the fragile sense of safety they had held on to. The murder had caused an upheaval, but it was the truth behind it that now threatened to tear their lives apart. Poirot's gaze rested first on the elderly Mr. Sterling, the patriarch of the family. His normally stern expression seemed even more hardened than usual, and his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the arm of his chair. Poirot noted every small detail. The worthy older man shifted uncomfortably, the slight tightening of his lips. It all told a story of guilt, fear, and perhaps regret. Then his eyes flickered to Lady Evangeline. Despite her calm demeanor, Poirot could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers, so poised and graceful in front of her, were now clenched tightly. He had seen this behavior before, anxiety that stemmed not from the fear of being caught, but the terror of facing something much worse. He turned his attention to the others, each of them presenting a unique puzzle piece. The young and rather naive Miss Penelope, whose wide eyes betrayed a sense of fear that belied her outward appearance. The cool and aloof Dr. Hargrave, who had been so certain of his innocence, yet his demeanor had begun to crack under Poirot's scrutiny. And lastly, the seemingly indifferent but calculating Mr. Gregory, whose sharp eyes were never still, constantly measuring those around him. Poirot had learned to read these subtle signs over the course of the investigation, and they spoke volumes. However, as the storm outside intensified, the detective's mind remained focused. He had pieced together the various motivations, the lies, and the deceit. Now, it was time to reveal the truth. "You have all played your parts in this grand performance," Poirot began, his voice steady, calm, yet carrying the weight of authority. "But there is one among you who has made the most fatal mistake, thinking they could outwit me." The room went silent, the tension thickening with each passing second. The light from the chandelier flickered slightly, as if in response to the storm raging outside. Poirot's gaze swept across the room once more, his sharp mind calculating the reactions of those before him. Lady Evangeline was the first to speak, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "Poirot, you are not implying that one of us here is the murderer, are you?" Her words were careful, measured, but Poirot could see the panic lurking just beneath the surface. The edges of her perfectly composed mask were beginning to crack. Poirot raised one hand, signaling for silence. "I do not imply, madame. I state, you have all been deceiving yourselves, thinking that you could escape my little gray cells." He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward the man sitting across from him. "Mr. Gregory. You especially, Monsieur Gregory." Mr. Gregory's eyes flashed with surprise, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He leaned forward slightly, his voice controlled, but his eyes betrayed a hint of concern. "What do you mean by that, Poirot? Are you suggesting that I had anything to do with this?" Poirot leaned back in his chair, folding his hands neatly in front of him. "I have observed all of you, Monsieur Gregory. Each of you has played your part in this mystery. But you, monsieur, have woven the threads that have held everything together, including the lies that have kept the truth hidden." Mr. Gregory scoffed, shaking his head. "This is absurd. I have nothing to hide. You're grasping at straws, Poirot." But Poirot was not so easily deterred. "No, monsieur. It is not I who grasp at straws. It is you who have woven a web of deception so intricate that even I nearly fell into it." He paused, letting the words sink in before he continued. "You believed that you could use your knowledge of the nursery rhyme as a smokescreen? But it was never about the rhyme, was it?" Flash of understanding passed across Mr. Gregory's face, followed by a brief flicker of unease. He quickly masked it with a forced smile. "You really are a master of theatrics, Poirot. But I assure you, your theories are nothing but nonsense." Poirot's expression hardened slightly. "Perhaps you are right, Monsieur Gregory. Perhaps I am merely a foolish Belgian detective who has overlooked the obvious. But what of the letter you received which you so conveniently forgot to mention? The one that tied you to the very crime that has perplexed us all?" The mention of the letter caused a visible change in Gregory's demeanor. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face paling slightly. The room was deathly silent as Poirot's words hung in the air. "You see, Monsieur Gregory," Poirot continued, his voice low and deliberate, "you were not the innocent bystander you would have us believe. Your actions were calculated, methodical. You knew, from the very beginning, that the victim's death would lead us to a place where you could manipulate the events to your favor. The other members of the group exchanged nervous glances, none of them daring to speak. Even Lady Evangeline, who had maintained such poise throughout the investigation, now seemed unsure of herself. She had underestimated Poirot's ability to see through her every move, and now it seemed that Mr. Gregory was no exception. Poirot leaned forward, his sharp gaze never leaving Gregory. "But I am not finished yet. There is more to this than just your manipulation of the clues. It is the psychology, the human nature behind the crime, that reveals the true extent of your guilt." Gregory's expression faltered, but he quickly regained control. "What are you saying? That I killed someone? You're mad, Poirot." Poirot shook his head, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "No, Monsieur Gregory, you did not kill, but you orchestrated the events that led to the death. You pulled the strings, watching as the chaos unfolded. And in the end, you believed that your scheme would remain unpunished." The silence in the room was deafening now, each of them waiting for the final revelation. Poirot's eyes never wavered as he addressed Gregory once more. "You underestimated one thing, Monsieur Gregory. You underestimated the power of my little gray cells. And now the truth is here for all to see." The storm outside had reached its peak, the winds howling and the rain slashing against the windows. Inside the mansion, however, the real storm was about to break. The web of lies had been unraveled, and the pieces were finally falling into place. Chapter 19. The final truth revealed. The room was filled with an air of palpable tension, as if time itself had frozen, awaiting Poirot's next move. The thunderstorm outside continued to rage, its relentless pounding against the windows, echoing the storm brewing within. Poirot's eyes, sharp and unyielding, moved over the group assembled before him. Every face in the room had shifted under his gaze, but it was clear to him that only one could be the true mastermind behind the twisted events that had unfolded. He had already unmasked Monsieur Gregory for the orchestrator he was, yet the full truth had not yet come to light. There was more to this mystery, more to the web of deception, and Poirot knew it was time to deliver the final blow. With a calmness that contrasted sharply with the fierce storm outside, he stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, each step punctuated with the weight of finality. "Messieurs et mesdames," Poirot began, his voice carrying the perfect balance of authority and quiet command. "You have all been caught in the trap of your own making. But the truth, as always, is simple. It is only the human mind that complicates it." Lady Evangeline shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting nervously toward Gregory, who had grown noticeably tense. He opened his mouth, likely to speak, but Poirot raised a hand, halting him instantly. "You speak, Monsieur Gregory, but you are not yet done with me," Poirot continued. "You had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Yet there is something far darker at play in this case. It is not only you who should bear the weight of this crime. You were but a puppet." The gasps from the gathered group were almost imperceptible, but Poirot knew exactly what he had ignited. A flicker of fear spread across Gregory's face, yet he quickly composed himself, trying to dismiss the accusation as an unfounded bluff. But Poirot, of course, never bluffed. Let us go back to the beginning, to the nursery rhyme, which has served as a most useful distraction. Poirot continued, a small smile curling at the edges of his lips. The rhyme, I must admit, was a clever touch. But the real key to this case, the thing that has remained hidden all along, is not the rhyme itself, but the very reason it was used. Gregory's eyes narrowed, and he shifted slightly in his chair. He was no longer the self-assured man who had maintained his composure for so long. Now, he was on the defensive, his carefully constructed mask beginning to crack. You see, Poirot said, stepping closer, the rhyme was meant to do one thing, to lead us astray. The rhyme, in all its charm, disguised something far more sinister. It provided an alibi, a misdirection, a false trail for all of us to follow. But you, Monsieur Gregory, you knew that the rhyme was a lie. And so did the true mastermind behind this plot. The silence in the room was now suffocating. Gregory, for the first time, seemed lost for words. His chest heaved slightly, and his hands clenched together, betraying his calm demeanor. The tension in the room was unbearable, every person in the room now hanging on Poirot's every word. Perhaps you are beginning to see the truth now, Poirot said, his tone now laced with certainty. You see, Monsieur Gregory, the reason you are able to remain so calm, the reason you are able to manipulate the situation and plant false evidence is because the true culprit, the mastermind behind this entire scheme, is someone far closer to you than anyone realized. At this, the room's energy shifted again. The realization hit those present like a wave. Poirot was not just implicating Gregory, he was pointing a finger at someone else entirely. The other guests exchanged glances, some with suspicion, others with horror. Poirot, who had been observing every nuance, every shift in body language, allowed the tension to build before revealing the one thing they had all missed. The true mastermind behind these events, Poirot said slowly, his eyes never leaving Gregory's, is none other than your sister, Miss Penelope. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Penelope's pale face flushed a deep shade of crimson, and she stumbled slightly in her seat. Her shock was evident, but Poirot had already anticipated this reaction. "Ah, Madame Penelope," Poirot said with a touch of sadness in his voice. "You believed that you could hide behind your sweet, innocent facade. You thought no one would suspect the delicate young woman who has seemed so untouched by the world's darkness. But it was you all along, wasn't it?" Miss Penelope's breath caught in her throat, and she shook her head vehemently, the color draining from her face as she tried to maintain her composure. "No. No, that's impossible. You're wrong, Poirot. I could never." But Poirot held up his hand, his expression stern. "You have underestimated me, Miss Penelope. All your careful maneuvering, all the efforts to distract from the real crime. Your plan was brilliant, yet ultimately flawed." He walked toward her, each step deliberate, as if he was savoring the final moments of the puzzle's completion. "You used Gregory as your pawn, played on his greed, his desire for power. And together, you devised this elaborate scheme to murder your father and inherit the family fortune. But you, Miss Penelope, were the one who orchestrated it all." Penelope's shoulders slumped and her eyes glistened with tears, though whether from guilt or anger was hard to discern. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The truth, so carefully buried for so long, was now laid bare. Your alibi, Poirot continued, was flawless in its simplicity. You were the first to suggest the nursery rhyme, knowing full well that it would throw us off the scent. You used it to manipulate everyone in this room into thinking you were an innocent bystander, but the smallest detail, a small slip-up during your questioning, a tremor in your voice at the wrong moment, those were the things that gave you away. He turned to address the room, his voice calm but powerful. It was you, Miss Penelope, who wrote the letter to Gregory, knowing he would be too blinded by his ambition to see the true nature of your plan. It was you who had access to the victim's room, to the key that unlocked the safe where the precious heirloom was kept. Gregory opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot silenced him with a sharp glance. You were but a pawn, Monsieur Gregory. The true power in this game rested with Miss Penelope, who manipulated you like a chess piece. Penelope, now visibly shaken, finally looked up at Poirot, her face a mixture of defiance and sorrow. You don't understand, she whispered. I had no choice. I had to. Poirot's voice softened, but there was no mistaking the finality in his words. No, madame, you had a choice, and you chose to betray everything, to murder your own father for the sake of wealth and power. You played the perfect game, but you lost. The storm outside seemed to quiet as Penelope's shoulders shook with the weight of her admission. Her eyes met Poirot's, and for the first time, she seemed to see him not as an obstacle to her plans, but as the one who had exposed her motives, and her lies. Chapter 20. The Web Unravels. The room was in complete silence. All the guests, once so certain of their innocence, now sat frozen in place, their expressions a mix of disbelief, shock, and growing fear. The revelation Poirot had made shook them to their core. Penelope, the young and seemingly fragile daughter, had been the mastermind behind it all. The web of lies, deceit, and manipulation she had spun over the past months was now fully exposed. As Poirot's gaze swept across the room, it was clear to him that each individual had their own role to play in this tragedy, but none of them had been prepared for the grand scale of her involvement. Even Gregory, her own brother, seemed as if he was seeing her for the first time. He had believed in her innocence, had allowed himself to be manipulated by her delicate exterior. But now he was facing the truth. His sister had been the one who had set everything into motion. Poirot could see the guilt on Gregory's face as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The realization was dawning on him that he had been just as complicit in his sister's crime as she had been in his. The two of them had been the perfect team, a mastermind and a willing accomplice. But now they were both trapped. Poirot turned his attention back to Penelope, who had gone silent, her eyes lowered to the floor as if she could no longer bear to look anyone in the eye. Her tears had dried, leaving her face pale and set in a grim expression. She had been caught, and there was no escape. You thought you could get away with it, Poirot said softly, his voice cutting through the stillness. You thought you could hide behind the guise of innocence, but you underestimated me, Miss Penelope. I saw through your deception from the moment I set foot in this house. Penelope didn't respond immediately. She sat motionless, as if pondering her next move. But Poirot knew there was no escape for her now. He could see it in her eyes. She was ready to face the consequences, but not without a final act of defiance. "I never wanted to kill him," Penelope finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I only wanted the inheritance. He was too controlling, too demanding. And when he threatened to disown me, I couldn't bear it. I thought I could scare him into submission. You thought you could manipulate him into giving you what you wanted," Poirot corrected gently. "But that is where you made your fatal mistake. You underestimated not only your father, but everyone in this house." Penelope's eyes flickered with a flash of anger, but she quickly smothered it. She had long ago learned how to hide her emotions, and Poirot knew that her sudden outburst was the last vestige of resistance she could muster. "And Gregory," Poirot continued, turning his attention to the man sitting beside her. "You were complicit in your sister's plan. You allowed yourself to be swayed by her charm, by her promises of wealth and power." Gregory's face reddened with shame. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He had no defense. He had been played, manipulated by someone he thought he could trust above all others. His sister had used his own weaknesses against him, and now he was paying the price. "You were both willing to go to any lengths to secure the fortune," Poirot went on, his voice becoming colder. "But your plans, like all plans built on deception, were flawed. The very thing that you thought would shield you, the nursery rhyme, became your undoing. The rhyme, which had been central to their strategy, was now a symbol of their arrogance. It had been a clever diversion, designed to mislead the authorities and point the blame elsewhere. But Poirot had seen through it. He had understood its true purpose from the moment he first heard it." Penelope's face twisted in frustration. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice rising in volume. "I had no choice. He would never have given me what I wanted, never. He was too proud, too stubborn. I couldn't live like that anymore. I thought if I just made him afraid enough, he would bend to my will." Poirot sighed, his expression softening slightly. "You were not alone in your desire for control, Miss Penelope. But what you failed to realize was that true power comes not from manipulation, but from understanding the truth, from seeing through the lies and the deceit." She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I only wanted to be free," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I could live my life without him controlling me. But now I'm trapped." Poirot remained silent for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. He could see the regret in her eyes, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The death of her father, the chaos that had ensued, could not be undone. "Do you think you can undo all of this with regret?" Poirot asked quietly. "You cannot take back the actions you have taken, Miss Penelope, but you can face the consequences with dignity. That is your only remaining choice." Penelope's gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment, there was something in her eyes that resembled understanding. She had always been a calculator. Her actions had led her down a path from which there was no return. Poirot turned his attention to the others in the room, who had been silent observers to the final revelation. They had all witnessed the unraveling of the mystery, and now they understood the depth of the deception that had taken place. You may all wonder how I arrived at the truth. Poirot continued, addressing the room. It was not through physical evidence or forensic analysis, but through psychology. The human mind, when pushed to its limits, reveals its true nature. And Miss Penelope's mind, though brilliant, betrayed her in the end. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The nursery rhyme, the alibis, the carefully constructed lies, these were all distractions. But when you look beyond the surface, when you listen to the nuances of a person's behavior, the truth becomes clear. Poirot turned back to Penelope, who had gone still again. You wanted to control your father, to manipulate him into giving you what you wanted. But in the end, it was not him you were controlling, but yourself. You became a prisoner of your own schemes. Penelope's shoulders slumped and she closed her eyes, as if to block out the weight of the words. But there was no escaping the reality now. The truth had been laid bare. And so, the case is closed, Poirot said softly, his voice filled with a quiet finality. Justice will be served and the truth will remain forever etched in the minds of those who witnessed this unfolding. As he turned to leave the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence, he couldn't help but reflect on the complexity of the human mind. How easily it could be swayed, manipulated, and twisted by its own desires. And yet, even in the face of such darkness, Poirot had found the light of truth. Chapter 21. The Final Moment of Reckoning. The rain had started to pour in sheets outside the mansion, casting a gloomy and depressive atmosphere over the proceedings. The once elegant home, now tarnished by betrayal, stood silent under the storm's heavy weight. Inside, Poirot remained calm and composed as ever, sitting across from Penelope, whose face had lost the last remnants of the defiance she had clung to since the moment of her revelation. Her posture had collapsed, no longer a proud, scheming woman, but a broken soul who had realized the gravity of her actions. For Poirot, however, this was but the beginning of a final reckoning. The case, though seemingly solved, still held one last, crucial moment of truth. The true extent of Penelope's involvement in her father's murder was clearer now than ever. But there were still questions that needed answers. For Poirot, no case could ever be considered closed without complete understanding of the motive, the methods, and the mind that had orchestrated such a crime. And so, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woman across from him. Miss Penelope, Poirot said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of his final examination. You have admitted to the crime, and I believe you are now ready to face the consequences. But tell me this, why the nursery rhyme? Why create such a curious, convoluted diversion? Penelope's gaze dropped, her eyes tracing invisible patterns on the wooden table. I thought it would confuse the investigation, she said slowly, as if measuring each word carefully. A childish thing, a distraction. I thought if the authorities focused on the rhyme, they'd never suspect me. Poirot tilted his head, a slight smirk curling at the corner of his lips. Ah, but you forget, Miss Penelope, I do not fall into such distractions. The rhyme, yes, it was strange, but what I found curious was not the rhyme itself, but what it symbolized. You see, I have always been one to observe, not just the actions of individuals, but the subtleties that others overlook. The rhyme, "Sing a song of sixpence." It was as signaled, was it not? Penelope remained silent, her eyes darting nervously. But Poirot could already see the subtle admission in her hesitation. "Yes," he continued, "the nursery rhyme was a carefully chosen code. A message hidden in plain sight. Sixpence. It was not a child's nonsense, but a deliberate marker. Something linked to the family fortune. I believe the rhyme was not just meant to confuse. It was meant to ensure that everyone looked in the wrong direction. It pointed toward the treasure that lay beneath the surface. But only someone with a trained eye would see the true connection." Penelope's lips quivered as she struggled to maintain composure. But Poirot saw through her defenses. He could tell she had already begun to unravel, and he would not let her mislead him any longer. Her words had already betrayed her once, and she was no longer capable of hiding the truth. "I needed him gone," Penelope said in a quiet whisper, her voice breaking. "He had no intention of sharing the inheritance with me. It was all a game to him. His power, his control over me. I had to do something. I had to make him see that I wasn't a child anymore, that I could be in charge of my own destiny." Poirot sat back in his chair, folding his hands neatly in front of him as he absorbed her words. There was no more pretense now. The mask had fallen. What remained was a woman desperate for control, who had taken her future into her own hands, but at the cost of everything else. The cost of a father's life, the peace of a household, and the trust of a family. "But you were not the only one in this house with motives," Poirot said, drawing her attention back to him. "Gregory, your brother, was equally ensnared in your plan, was he not? He had his own reasons for going along with your scheme. But I know it was not simply for the inheritance." Penelope looked up sharply, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Gregory, he had no part in this. He was just a victim too." Poirot shook his head slowly. "I cannot agree, Miss Penelope. Gregory was no innocent. He too was driven by his own desires, his own needs. He was blinded by his loyalty to you, but he was not without his own ambitions. Gregory did not act out of mere brotherly love. No, he saw in your plan an opportunity for himself. He thought he could gain something by following your lead." Penelope's face drained of color as she absorbed Poirot's words. "Gregory," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Poirot continued. "Gregory's involvement was subtle but no less dangerous. He did not initially understand the full extent of your plan, but when he saw the consequences unfolding, he too was ensnared. His ambition got the better of him. You gave him a glimpse of power, of the future he might have, and that clouded his judgment. The moment you orchestrated your father's death, Gregory became complicit in the crime." The room fell into a deep silence as Penelope looked away, her hands trembling in her lap. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil inside her. She had always believed she could control her brother, could keep him under her influence. But now, with the truth out in the open, the weight of her manipulation became clear. Poirot pressed on, his voice calm but resolute. "Your brother, Miss Penelope, he was not the same man who came to you for help. His actions were shaped by his own weaknesses, his desires for wealth and security, just like yours. But unlike you, he was not as willing to carry the burden of guilt. Gregory's own descent into this plan was, perhaps, more out of fear than ambition. But in the end, he was no less culpable. Penelope's lips parted, but she couldn't find the words to refute him. What Poirot said was true, and deep down, she knew it. She had used him, just as she had used her father. The puzzle pieces were fitting together now in a way she had never expected. "The truth is," Poirot said softly, "the only person who truly understood the consequences of your actions was your father. He knew exactly what you were capable of, Miss Penelope. And that, I believe, is why he chose to act when he did." Penelope's face tightened. Her father's death had been a result of a carefully planned execution, and Poirot was now suggesting that he had known she would betray him. Perhaps he had always known that she would be the one to try to take the inheritance from him, that she would stop at nothing to gain control over his legacy. Poirot's voice rang out again, his words leaving no room for doubt. "I had suspected as much from the beginning, you see. The clues were all there, hidden beneath layers of deceit, false alibis, and half-truths. But in the end, Miss Penelope, it was your own mind that betrayed you. The truth was in the smallest of details. The way you tried to divert attention, the way you manipulated others, the way you turned to your brother for help. All of it led me to you." Penelope swallowed hard, unable to speak. Her tears had long since dried, and now there was only the weight of Poirot's words. She had thought herself clever, but she had underestimated the power of Poirot's little gray cells. "And now," Poirot said, his voice softening but firm, "the truth is known. There is no escape for you, Miss Penelope. There is no justification for what you have done. You will face the consequences of your actions." As the final words hung in the air, Poirot stood and walked to the door. He had done his part, and now the truth was in the open. The storm outside had subsided, but the storm within the mansion would take much longer to calm. Penelope's fate was sealed. Chapter 22. The Echoes of Deceit. The morning after the storm, the mansion seemed eerily still, as if it were holding its breath. The sky, now clear and bright, shed its cool light through the tall windows of the study, where Poirot and Captain Hastings stood, surveying the scene. The remnants of the storm had left their mark. But it was not just the weather that weighed heavily on the atmosphere. The investigation had reached its final moments, but the air was thick with unspoken truths. Poirot's sharp eyes took in every detail: the meticulously arranged furniture, the antique vases standing in delicate balance, the faded tapestry hanging by the window. Each element of the room told a story. But it was the people who inhabited this space that had shaped its darkest narrative. The truth had not come easily, and Poirot knew that this final revelation would have consequences not only for Penelope, but for all who were connected to her. Hastings, as ever, was keen to understand the complexities Poirot had untangled so delicately. "Or so, Poirot," he began, his voice full of anticipation. "You've concluded that Miss Penelope masterminded her father's murder. But what of Gregory? Is he truly as guilty as she is?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the window, his gaze lost in the expanse of the garden outside. It had rained the night before, and the flowers glistened with dewdrops, their colors brighter in the aftermath of the storm. It was a picture of renewal, but Poirot knew all too well that this moment was one of finality. a moment when the past could no longer be ignored. "Hastings," Poirot began, his voice measured. "The case is more complex than you might think. Miss Penelope may have been the architect of the crime, but Gregory's role cannot be dismissed. He may not have actively planned the murder, but he was complicit in a way that speaks to his own weaknesses." Hastings nodded, his brow furrowing. "Complicit? But how? I thought he was just following his sister's orders." "Not entirely," Poirot said with a knowing smile. "Gregory had his own motivations. You see, Gregory had his own reasons for agreeing to the plan. He wanted the inheritance just as much as Penelope. But he did not have the resolve to act alone. Penelope, with her determination and manipulation, used Gregory's insecurities to her advantage. She convinced him that this was the only way to secure their future. So, it was more than just her influence," Hastings mused. "It was his ambition, as well." "Precisely," Poirot said. "Gregory's participation was born of his desire for wealth and power. He did not want to take the ultimate step himself, but he was willing to support his sister's plan in exchange for the spoils. It was a quiet betrayal of his own morals, but it was no less harmful for being done in the shadows. The truth hung in the air, heavy and suffocating." Poirot turned to face his friend, his expression serious. "Gregory is not a murderer, in the same way Penelope is, but he is still guilty. His greed blinded him to the consequences of his actions. By failing to intervene, he allowed his sister's plans to unfold." Hastings was silent for a moment, considering Poirot's words. Then, his face softened with understanding. "So, in the end, it was Penelope's ambition that drove the entire thing. But Gregory is a victim of his own desires." Poirot's eyes twinkled with a touch of sympathy. "Yes, Hastings, that is true. Gregory was a pawn in his sister's game, but he was not without agency. He made the choice to go along with her plan, and in doing so, he sealed his fate just as much as she did." The room seemed to grow colder as Poirot's words settled into the silence. There was no denying the complexity of human nature, and this case had laid bare the darkness that could lurk in even the most seemingly innocent relationships. Penelope had orchestrated her father's murder with a cold precision that had left no room for doubt. But Gregory's involvement had been equally damaging. The sound of footsteps interrupted the quiet contemplation of the two men. It was Chief Inspector Japp, who entered the room with a somber expression on his face. His uniform was neat, but his demeanor betrayed the weight of the investigation that had consumed them all for days. "Poirot, Hastings," Japp said, his voice low. "I've just spoken to the coroner. The results came in, and they confirm what you suspected. The cause of death was poisoning. The substance was a rare compound, hard to trace unless you know what you're looking for. It seems the old man ingested it in his wine shortly before he collapsed." Poirot nodded gravely, absorbing the information. The wine, of course. Penelope used it to execute the plan without suspicion. She was clever in choosing such a slow-acting poison. It allowed her the time to create an alibi, to misdirect the investigation. The entire household was kept in the dark until it was too late. Japp's face twisted with frustration. But why not just shoot him or stab him? Why go to all that trouble? "Ah," Poirot said with a smile. That is where Miss Penelope showed her true understanding of human nature. A direct approach would have left too many traces. Poisoning, especially with such a rare substance, was far more subtle. It allowed her to maintain control over the situation. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed her to remain in the shadows, manipulating those around her. Japp shook his head, clearly impressed by the thoroughness of Poirot's analysis. I see now. She didn't want the crime to be tied to her directly. She wanted to make it look like an accident. But Gregory's role was always going to be exposed, wasn't it? Yes, Poirot said. Gregory's guilt was bound to be revealed eventually. But it was Penelope who made sure that the blame would fall on him as well. She played on his weaknesses, made him think that his involvement would be the key to their shared fortune. But in the end, it was her actions that doomed them both. The conversation shifted as the three men considered their next steps. The case was nearing its conclusion, but Poirot knew that they had to act quickly. Penelope had been arrested, and Gregory was already under suspicion. But there were still loose ends to tie up before the final pieces of the puzzle could be locked into place. Poirot, Japp said, his voice laced with concern. What happens now? What do we do about Gregory? Poirot looked up, his face impassive. Gregory must face the consequences of his actions. He may not have been the mastermind, but he chose to participate. His guilt will be established in court. But I believe that he can still be redeemed should he choose to atone for his role in this crime. Hastings frowned, still unsure. But do you think Gregory will ever admit his part in all this? Will he ever come clean? Poirot's eyes softened. That, my friend, is the greatest question of all. People are complicated, Hastings. They may not always act with the same clarity or intent, but in the end, their choices define them. Gregory may yet find the courage to face the truth about himself. As Poirot spoke, his mind wandered briefly to the tragic nature of human ambition, the way in which a single desire could twist the lives of so many. Penelope had sought to control her fate, but in doing so, she had unleashed a chaos that could not be contained. Gregory, too, had succumbed to the same impulses, but his path had been shaped by fear rather than greed. The investigation, it seemed, had not only revealed the dark sides of these individuals, but also shed light on the complexities of their relationships. How easily they had been swayed by ambition. How easily they had chosen betrayal over loyalty. And yet, there was still one more thing to consider. Poirot's mind returned to the smallest details, the ones that had been overlooked. There were still questions that needed answers, details that needed clarifying before they could be truly satisfied that justice had been served. One thing remains, Hastings, Poirot said quietly, as the sun broke through the clouds and bathed the room in light. I believe the truth is never fully known until the last stone is turned over. And there are still stones left unturned in this case. Hastings looked at him perplexed. What do you mean? Poirot smiled, his eyes gleaming with the promise of a final revelation. It is not enough to solve a crime. We must understand the why and the how, so that nothing remains hidden in the shadows. With that, Poirot turned and walked toward the door, leaving Hastings and Japp to ponder the full scope of the case. The mystery had come close to its resolution, but the journey was far from over the end.